Welcome to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is an introduction to minerals, and we're going to cover two chunks of this chapter. This first video will talk about how minerals form, and then a subsequent video will talk about different mineral groups based on chemistry. So take a good look at this picture. This will come up again in our discussion about mineral groups. This is a real picture. This is not photoshopped. These are giant blades of gypsum. So without further ado, let's start talking about how minerals form. So there are three different ways that we are going to talk about. This is a picture from Iceland in March of 2015. This was the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull volcano, and it emitted enough ash that it actually disrupted a lot of flights between North America and Europe for the summer of 2015. And this isn't a perfect picture of this particular mineral formation method, but it's a pretty cool one. So minerals form in three different ways. The one that's hardest to get a picture of really is this, and that is the cooling of magma. Magma is molten rock that cools below Earth's surface. Once magma erupts at the surface, it is then called lava, but until then it's called magma. Magma cools generally a lot slower than lava. If you think about it, that's because the Earth itself is pretty warm. So if you had a Thanksgiving turkey and you finished cooking it and you took it out and you put it on the stovetop, it would cool a whole lot faster on the stovetop than it would if you turned off the stove and you left it inside the stove, right? Because the stove is still pretty warm. So for that reason, the minerals cool from the magma very slowly because the Earth is still warm. While that happens, magma cools into different minerals in sort of a pretty predictable order that we'll talk about more in our next chapter. But this is a picture of lava cooling at the surface. However, minerals are usually forming well below the surface in a much longer time scale. It might take, depending on the size of the magma chamber, somewhere on the order of a few hundred to several thousand years for a magma chamber to cool. Okay, so that's the first way that minerals can form. The second and third both have to do with water. So this is a picture from Yellowstone National Park. This is one of my favorite spots in Yellowstone. This is called Grand Prismatic Spring. And Grand Prismatic Spring is famous for its beautiful colors. The colors in Grand Prismatic Spring exist because there are bacterial mats that are in the water here. So the water in Grand Prismatic Spring is incredibly hot. In the center, where it's sort of this darker blue color, the water is on the order of 170 to 180 degrees Celsius, and it grades out to about 125 degrees, this is in Fahrenheit, 180 Fahrenheit here, and about 125 Fahrenheit here. The real part of this that makes it extra deadly, though, is that the pH of the water is incredibly low. It's very acidic. And so it has a pH similar to your stomach acid. It's incredibly deadly. But regardless, off of magma chambers comes a lot of water. And the water contains a lot of dissolved minerals. So as that water is traveling away from the hot magma source, what will start to happen is that water will cool down and the minerals that are dissolved in that hot acidic water will begin to form solids. It's a process that your book talks about called precipitation, where minerals go from being dissolved in water to kind of forming along the cavities in the subsurface. A lot of the minerals that form in hot springs are very rich in sulfur because there's a lot of sulfur associated with volcanoes. So sphalerite is an example of a mineral with sulfur in it. Galena. Several of the minerals actually that you saw during lab this week, pyrite and chalcopyrite, all have different varieties of sulfur. So they can form below the surface of the Earth, where water is carrying minerals away from magma chambers near hot springs like we see here. So the third location where water can form minerals is in what are called deep sea vents. This is a really cool location. So this is about a mile off the coast of Washington State, actually it's more than a mile. I'm lying to you. I'm sorry. It's near the mid-ocean ridge, not far from Washington State, but not a mile, several miles really. And What happens there is that the basalt, which is the ocean crust, is fractured. Hot water will percolate down into that basalt, and the acid and the heat from the magma chamber right below the mid-ocean ridge will create a tremendous amount of dissolved minerals. And those dissolved minerals will then become superheated and move up through the fractures and hit the cold water at the base of the ocean. When that hot water that's full of minerals hits the cold ocean, it starts to form these very tall chimneys. They're often called hydrothermal vents. They've been called black smokers. They're fascinating. And so hydrothermal vents can be found all along mid-ocean ridges. In some cases, they are over 700 degrees Celsius. The water is very hot. And they were first seen in 1976. There was a researcher named Bob Ballard. Bob Ballard is actually really famous for discovering the Titanic. He is now a geoarchaeologist, but in the 70s, Bob Ballard really wanted to be one of the first people to see the mid-ocean ridge. So he went down in a submersible that's still used today called the Alvin off the coast of Washington. Actually, he went off the coast of the Galapagos, and they went to take a measurement. They were pretty sure that they were going to find basically underwater geysers, and they did. It was so hot that their thermometer probe broke and melted. What they didn't expect to find, which was an even bigger discovery, was all of this stuff over here. So these are tube worms, and this is actually a fascinating story that we'll learn more about later. But the tube worms host a bacteria in this red portion of the tube worm. So this was 2 miles below the surface of the earth, or below the sea level. And so folks didn't really think that they were going to see a whole lot of life down there, because in the 1970s, people believed that the whole food chain was based on photosynthesis, and you had to be close to the surface where light would penetrate so that there could be plant life. But the bacteria that live near hydrothermal vents, and we now know live in Yellowstone as well, didn't use photosynthesis to make food. They actually figured out how to take sulfur out of this water that's coming out of these hydrothermal vents and convert sulfur into food. It's a process similar to photosynthesis. It's called chemosynthesis. And chemosynthesis is the process of taking chemicals and turning them into food. So then these tube worms, which can be 6 to 8 feet long, are almost like a host for the bacteria, and they almost farm the bacteria, because the bacteria are allowed to live on the tube worm and they are allowed to continue to grow, but the tube worm eats a certain amount of the bacteria to stay alive. And then there are organisms like very primitive shrimp that have no eyes because they don't need eyes 2 miles below the surface. There are crabs that live in this area. There's a whole ecosystem, and that was completely unexpected in the 1970s. In fact, if you've taken a biology class and you've heard of the kingdom Archaea, Archaea was not known about until this discovery, which is pretty cool. I know for a lot of young folks, the 1970s seemed like they were really a long time ago. I wasn't alive during them, but I'm willing to bet that your parents were. So it's fascinating that so much of our knowledge about the earth has really come about in the last 100 years or so. So anyway, there is one more. Oh, did I lie to you? I did. I lied. There are 4 ways that minerals form, and these are the prettiest of the pictures. So this is a picture of Aruba. Aruba is an island in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Venezuela, and I was lucky enough to go there, probably about 10 years ago. One of the things that the Caribbean is so well known for is its beautiful turquoise waters, like you can see here. So these are some sweet tiki huts in Aruba. What makes the turquoise water of the Caribbean Sea, though, is that it is full of calcite, dissolved calcite. And as that calcite turns from being dissolved back into solid crystals, it creates this beautiful blue color. Because it's very hot in the Caribbean, you have the high evaporation rates from the seawater. So there's a lot of water and a lot of calcite in the Caribbean Sea. When you take that water out by evaporation, it leaves the calcite behind, and that the little tiny crystals of calcite cause the light to refract and make this blue color. Another example of minerals that form from the evaporation of seawater is the salt flats of halite near the Great Salt Lake in Utah. So as you can see here in the background are the Wasatch Mountains, and streams will carry salt from down the Wasatch Mountains basically to accumulate in the lowest point near Salt Lake City in the Great Salt Lake. So this part of Utah is also a desert, so it has really high evaporation rates, and when the salt water gets evaporated, the water is evaporated and the salt is left behind. You can also see this forming in Lake Mead in Arizona. So this is the part of the Hoover Dam. The rest of the dam is over here, and it's right at the border between Nevada and Arizona, and it creates a very large reservoir behind the dam. This white line is often referred to as a bathtub ring on Lake Mead. So in the 1990s, Lake Mead was much higher in elevation, and that's because there has been more water use since then, and there are times when Lake Mead goes through a period of drought and there's high evaporation rates there. When the water is evaporated away, the gypsum that is dissolved in the water forms a film on the outside of Lake Mead, and so that's what this is. This is a layer of evaporated gypsum that formed as the water was evaporated out of Lake Mead. So if you remember in lab last week, one of the good ways to identify gypsum is because it has thin little layers, and this is how those layers form. So these are 4 ways that minerals form. In general, we're talking about the cooling of magma and different things that happen to water that cause the precipitation of minerals. Thanks.